This is a section that covers the topic you care most about. Climate change, rights for refugees, violence against women. Climate change, rights for refugees, violence against women. I'm just saying, you'll be asked to do something, so you should actually care about the topic. So, climate change, rights for refugees, violence against women.
This day, I saved myself 15 dollars. I started recording.
As you guys know, we'll have a number of guest speakers throughout the semester, and so all of the fellows, all of my teaching fellows will give lectures either alone or in tandem on topics about which they research. So we have our first guest lecturer today, who I'm going to introduce in just a second, but I want to give you a roadmap for the next weekend, okay? As a reminder, on Wednesday, Cherokee Chief Chuck Hoskins will be here, and he's going to speak about sovereignty, civil liberties issues, and civil rights issues in regard to tribes in the United States. On Friday, we have the privilege walk in your labs, and on Monday, your first exam. Now, some of you have sent me emails saying, hey, the link to the questions don't work. It doesn't work. That's because we're updating them with this last lecture to make sure that those questions are accurate. They'll be there after class today, okay? So, first of all, hopefully you're sitting in the topic area where you're supposed to be. Violence against women, rights for refugees here in the middle, and climate change over to the right. And so Joy Rhodes, who is in her second semester as a PhD student, but has already completed her master's program in political science, actually public administration, is here lecturing today on civil rights movements. So let's have a big hand for Joy.
I started going, but I don't know why we're not picking me up here. Those of you that are just entering in, I don't know, this first class, no problem. All right, okay, I think I'm good. If not, y'all let me know if you can't hear me. I have a pretty loud voice already, so I think I'm holding down. So, over here, y'all talk to me. What section are you sitting in? Come on, let me hear you. What are you sitting? What section you sitting in? Up in here, where are you sitting at? Come on, let me hear you. Ready? Okay, and over here. Alright. I need to make sure you guys are locked in. Okay, I only got like 50 minutes with you guys, so do me a favor and give me your undivided attention. But if you're not, go ahead and give me your undivided attention. Give me a piece, please, right? And I'll make it worth your while. I promise. All right. Now, with that said, let's look at this quote here by James Baldwin. He says that everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Somebody raise their hand and tell me, what does it say to you? What is he saying here? What is he getting at? Don't be shy. Yeah.
The problem can only get solved if you actually look at the problem and find a solution for the problem instead of ignoring it.
Okay, so the problem can only be solved if you're finding a solution for it, right? If you don't do anything about it, it won't change. Is that what you're saying? All right, somebody else. Anybody else? All right. You say the same thing? All right, anybody want to ask that? Say frame? Anything? So essentially, yeah, right? We may not be able to change every single thing, but one thing that's guaranteed, we can't change something if we don't do anything about it. We don't face it, right? And that's the heart of the conversation that we'll be having today. Where movements really arise. The fact that we know something's wrong, right? But we're gonna place a demand on doing something about it. And if we don't, we're not gonna see that change. But we want to see the change, so we are gonna do something about it. So, I'm asking you guys a question. This poll question doesn't work like it used to, because we don't use engage anymore, and that's okay. So I'm gonna ask you guys by a show of hands, as I go through this list, tell me, which movement are you most familiar with? So first off, raise your hand if you're most familiar with the civil rights movement. What up, let me see. All right, that should be everybody. You've been sitting in lectures for the past couple of weeks, right? Now, what about the women's rights movement? Right here, you're pretty familiar with the women's rights movement. Not as many, that's all right. Hopefully we get down to the bottom of that today. Raise your hand. Raise your hand. If you're ready to kill someone, see your hand. And last one, the LGBTQIA plus movement, right? You're familiar with that in some way. All right, so the first thing we're gonna keep on is discriminatory behavior, right? Specifically against Americans, right? Or being discriminated against. Now, some of the goals that the movement wanted to accomplish was three things: abolish discrimination and abolish disenfranchisement. Can anybody raise their hand and tell me what disenfranchisement? What does that term mean? I'm gonna come over here, okay? Because you went, I'm gonna come to her, okay? Taking away the right to vote. Taking away the right to vote, right? Anybody want to add to that? Take away, right? Essentially, it's not just voting; it's just privileges in general. But typically, when you hear disenfranchisement, it is talking or referring to taking away someone's privilege or right to vote, right? And that's exactly what they were trying to abolish. Now, some of the methods they employed or how they were able to reach their goal was through a few ways. The first one is activism, right? Key figures. I call them emerging voices, but people who are willing to step up and say, I care about this cause, and I'm going to say something and do something about it. In the limelight, right? Now, there are emerging voices at times that are unseen, but they're definitely heard and they're definitely felt. Now, they also utilize peaceful civil disobedience. Sure, all you guys should be aware of some kind of based off the book and based off our lab last Friday. So can somebody raise their hand and tell me what is civil disobedience? Now my right hand is right here. Your right hand is right here. Don't make me come out. Civil disobedience.
Civil disobedience is having like a controlled, organized like way to protest that is civil, so you're doing it in like a non-violent, peaceful sort of way, to where the people that you're protesting against, or I guess the opposing people, will not turn it against you for using violence.
Yeah, so I think to extrapolate or simplify the thing, it's an act of going against the norm in order to bring about some kind of change, right? In a peaceful way. Anybody want to add to that? Are there some kind of passive resistance to refusing to obey the law? Passive resistance and refusing to obey the law. All right, and maybe that's the question. You guys talk about the exercising of it, but what exactly is maybe a formal definition of what civil disobedience is? Anybody, any other takers? Yeah.
They're peacefully assembling against what they feel is wrongly governing them.
Peacefully assembling against things that they believe are wrong against them?
Yeah.
Right, so, yeah, go ahead.
Wow.
Is that
I'm sitting at the restaurant, I didn't know like people.
So, another exercising of civil disobedience. Explain it to you in terms of how Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. explained it in the interview. They asked him, why would you do something that would incite so much violence and harm? He said civil disobedience. And civil disobedience is acting out against an unjust law. The key here, though, is the willingness to accept the penalties or the consequences that come behind your action. He then proceeds to argue that the issue of the segregation is that They are acting wrongly, but they are willing to accept the consequences behind their actions. And then he bolsters it even more and says, hey, look, the people who are far more worse than that are the moderates, right? People who will say something but won't put a feet behind what they're actually speaking, right? So essentially, civil disobedience is acting out against an unjust law and being willing to accept the consequences that come behind them. And he was very good at doing that. As you guys pointed out, we have things like sit-ins, boycotts, and protests, which are all methods or vehicles that allow movements to accomplish the goal that they have set out. Now, let's talk about the women's rights movement. I have a few hands up, right? So you guys should be a little bit familiar with this, but essentially the goals behind the women's rights movement. And I want to note this before I get into it more. Some of the goals I'm going to point out are coming from not only the historical women's rights movement, but also the women's rights, the second liberation of women's rights that we see in today's time. So women were fighting for things like equal pay, access to training, right? Equality, okay? Liberation and them having the right to their liberties and freedoms, right? Now, one thing that we see influential in this movement are court cases. One in particular that I like to point you guys' attention to is U.S. What was going on here was the Virginia Military Institute denied a woman access to the program based off of her sex. The court says, no, you can't do that. And you can't do that because the Institute failed to provide a persuasive argument as to why you're discriminating based off of sex. You can't do it, right? Then something else we've seen over for the women's rights movement kind of hits at that point of key figures or activists, right? We have Betty Friedan. Every time I put it, I'm so proud of guys. Betty Friedan. And she writes a book in 1963 that essentially has a conversation over how women are losing their identity. But you may ask yourself, why is this the case? Well, after you have held your identity within your husband so long, when these things start to change, what exactly does that mean for you as a woman? Where do you exist, right? But she's a key figure and leading into the second liberation of women's rights movement. Now, pointed out last week, I think we pointed out this class as well. The group that benefited most from the civil rights movement and act was middle class white women, right? They're able to step up a little bit more on the ladder, right? So let's talk about the next American movement. So you kind of know where I'm going with this. They were fighting for recognition of Indian treaties as well as sovereignty, right? Essentially, you guys, I want you to start picking up on some of the similar concepts that are going on within each movement. You guys ready for that? Yeah, oh, just for that, I got you. I have a problem. So they were fighting issues within education, right? Keep in mind, as I go through this movement, what all they have is confidence. Now, they is an American movement. They are the fastest growing minority group in the U.S. However, here in America. So their movement was ready to push the here in America that they did not have, right? And essentially, they were fighting against restrictions on immigration as well as employment. And they also wanted the right to really practice their religion. And again, you guys, make sure you're paying attention to the similar things that we see throughout all of these movements. Now, let's briefly touch on the Latino American community, right? What's going on in their movement? Well, this was to end discrimination, as well as stereotyping that happened within their community specifically. They also wanted to expand workers' rights, right? And why was that the case? They were working on farms and they were not being treated equally. And they said, this isn't right. We have to do something about it. They also were trying to fight for things like voting and education, very similar to the themes that come out when we think about the civil rights movement. Now, let's look at the two SL LGBTQIA+ community, right? What was going on with their community? Can anybody raise their hand and tell me what is the most notable thing that comes from their movement? What were they fighting?
I have a hand.
The right to not be killed in the streets, the Stonewall riots, to be specific.
Okay, let me go. Get the context behind it. That is a good point because this is where it starts at. And that's a good point, but can someone tell me what's the most notable thing? Maybe that you guys can think of outside of being killed in the streets for your sexual identity?
Mention of marriage.
All right, he said it. Say what we're talking, everybody.
Protection of marriage.
Protection of marriage, the right for you to marry who you want to marry, right? So, what we see is that some of the methods that they utilize in order to accomplish these goals were really held at the state level, where they were pretty much pushing ballot initiatives, right? They were also doing protests. And essentially, they got the right to marry. It was a great thing. Now, last but certainly not least, let's talk about a community that typically doesn't get addressed as well as they should when we consider movements and rights, the disabled community, right? In 1990, the ADA was passed, it was the American Disability Act. And essentially, they passed the act in order to allow those equal opportunity in the workplace. They also were pushing for accommodation in public places. And again, although these things may have been passed, sometimes in society we see that they may not be upheld, right? This university facto, and this is essentially where movements derive from. The fact that although laws are written about it, they're not being upheld. So a group of people say, we have to do something about it. So let me ask you guys another question. Now that we have some examples under our belt historically, what exactly is a movement? Right? What comes in your mind? Terms, formal definition, informal definition. What is a movement? Come on, let's be sorry. We just went through plenty of examples. What's a movement? In your words. Okay, I have one here. What is a movement?
A group of people standing out against injustice.
A group of people standing out against injustice. Exactly. Anybody want to add?
I got one thing to add. We're talking about the disabled. There's only 2 seats, I think, in this room for people with disabilities.
That's a good thing to point out.
I just now realized there's 1 seat here, one over there. That's it.
Yeah.
Recognizing that there's a problem, raising awareness about it, and then creating a call to action.
Okay. Even deeper, right? Anybody else want to add to that?
I just want to say, like, a movement is more of a widespread calling that not necessarily just a few people, but like recognizable across a vocation. But at the same time, I don't even think that has to be calling for recognition of an unjust thing. I think it just has to be a widespread pointing out. So less of a, this is a bad thing, but this needs to be addressed no matter what it is.
Okay, well, I'd like to push back a little bit against that. Just to clarify things for everybody, this typically are things that are unjust. Yeah. Right, because the issue has to be big enough, right, and widespread enough for enough people to care about it for it to be considered a movement. So a formal, but you're right on what you're saying, right? But I just wanted to clarify, okay? But to give everybody a formalized definition of what a movement is, we can look at a movement as an organization by a lot of people, which you guys think that, right? To bring about and lead social change, cultural change, and economic, and also political change, right? This point where you get so uncomfortable and you can't take it anymore. These laws are written, but they're not being upheld. People are facing injustice, and it's not all right. And this is essentially what a movement is. Now, let's go over a couple characteristics about a movement. The first one is social goals and change. And essentially an example of this is what injustice was being faced. What exactly were these groups of people or person have specifically faced, right? And this is really what's gonna be at the heart or start what a movement is. Then we move into organization. This essentially starts off small and gradually over time gets bigger, but something we can think of or example is grassroots organization for industry. For example, what Mothers Against Drug Driving, right? Everybody in here, I already covered that a couple weeks ago, right? But this was a local group of mothers who were tired of facing and watching their innocent children being killed by somebody who wanted to pick up a drink and decided to get behind the wheel of a car. They were so fed up with this that they banded together locally and said, we're gonna do something about it. We're gonna spread awareness about it, and this has to stop. Now, we have another characteristic which is relevance, right? And I think this might speak to your point a little bit that you brought up, right? When we think about movements, the issue has to be something that people care about. Although you may be facing something specifically, it may be important, but here on a wide scale, what are salient issues, right? What's going on? If you guys remember those things on the wall back there, and you're setting your groups based off of what those issues are and what you care about. Then you have the methodology, which is essentially those vehicles or the tool that you're going to use to get that point that I referenced, right? This right here, you want to employ to accomplish your goal, right? What are you going to do in order to make people aware of what situation that you're going through and what's been unjust, right? How are you going to do it? You have things like boycotts, which someone over here pointed out, right? Or sitting, protests, court cases, as well as public referendums. I will get more into detail about what public referendums are when we talk about where movements take place. But for now, just keep in mind, these are just a few examples of methodology in terms of how you're going to accomplish your goals within a movement. And last but not least, time, okay? Something we all have to know about movements is that it takes time. Starts off small and gradually it gets bigger and bigger. What I like to think about is like snowball effect, right? You have this little bitty thing and you can pull it, so it just gets big enough to where it just erupts, right? And that's some key characteristics of a movement. Now, let's ask ourselves, why do movements even take place, right? Not enough for us to just know something's unjust. Why exactly what's the approach? Well, this side that the existing system is not fair, and it's not. But more importantly, is that they have to come to this belief that something can actually happen and be changed about what's being done, right? But then more important than that, they place a demand on what that change is going to be, okay? Then we also see that confidence is gained through movement when you work together, right? When you come with other people, you realize that, hey, I may not be able to do it by myself, but their strength in what? What's their strength in? Numbers, right? Their strength in numbers, so I can get other people to get on my bandwagon and help me out. This may be a successful movement. So let's roll back a little bit because we covered a lot of information from the start of it. Okay? We started off with some historical examples, right, on movements that took place. Then we moved into what exactly a movement is by definition. Then we began to discuss some of the key characteristics that we see within a movement. And then we talked about why movements actually take place. So let me ask you this question. With all things considered, who could be a part of a movement? Who do you guys think could be part of a movement? Huh? Anyone. Essentially anybody, right? But what about those anybody's should they all have in common in terms of being a part of the movement? You said what?
I don't think I agree with anybody.
Okay, we're gonna get into what characteristics those anybody's have or what they share, right? Can anybody get at that, right? Who could be a part of the movement? Because essentially anybody can, but there are things that they need to have in order to be part of the movement, which is what? They have and I believe that something can actually be done. You think you can be excluded from movements? I'm sure you can. Yeah, I'm sure people can be excluded, but those people that are excluded probably don't fall in this category, right? So, let's look at this a little bit deeper. Essentially, like we said, anybody can be a part. But the people that participate all fall underneath the assumption that I'm going to work within collective action, right? I'm going to come into agreement with what's going on. Not gonna go wrong and do my I'm not gonna just, say I'm a part, but then do something completely different. I'm gonna come underneath agreement with what's going on for the movement. Then I'm gonna be cooperative, right? I'm gonna go with what we're doing as a whole for us to reach the overarching goal of our movement in the first place. And essentially, the necessary part of a common goal is that you have to reach it, right? Because again, it's power in numbers. You yourself can make a statement, right? But if you band together with other people, I guarantee you it's gonna have a bigger effect than your voice alone. Now, how do state movements get started? There's many reasons, I'm gonna cover just a few, right? But how do you guys think movements get started? Yeah.
Let's say either some big event happens that makes a big group of people all realize that there's a problem, or a group of small individuals or a small group of individuals have noticed the problem and they take the step forward and then people line up with it.
So there's something that's big enough that happens, right? And then other people decide that, yeah, this is something we should do something about it, essentially, or eventually they follow through with it, right? Is that what you're saying? So teaching, right? A big enough teaching. What else? What else? How does movement get started? Let me hear from my violence against women. What's going on? How do movements get started? What do you think? No right or wrong answer here. Nobody?
Right here.
Okay, I'll come to you next, okay?
You have to get information out.
You have to get information out. Really good one, right? People got to know what they're fighting for, okay? You guys doing that?
So it got started. I got that the idea that they want to do this.
You gotta know the fire starter. Somebody that's gonna be able to, let's get us going, right? So you have emerging voices, which is what you're pointing out. Somebody that's willing to come to the forefront and say, this is not right, and place a demand on that change that needs to happen. Then, operate underneath collective action, right? Coming into agreement with what we're actually going to do about this, right? And then lastly, messaging, which you pointed out, right? You gotta get your message out so people know exactly what you're talking about. So, I'm gonna ask for a few volunteers. Please don't be shy. I can probably almost guess who these people are gonna be based off who you're speaking, but maybe that's going to take. Raise your hand if you're willing to be an emerging voice for your section. Now, the sections are violence against women, rights for refugees, and climate change. Okay.
There could be more than one.
It can't be more than one. You two come up here. Who are not over here to violence against women? Who's bold enough? Come on, be bold. Please. Who's bold enough? Anybody else? Last call. Anybody confident enough, bold enough to stand up for what you believe? All right.
Violence against women, it's not doing so good.
It's okay, I'm gonna get into what's going on right here.
Oh, you guys.
That's all right. All right, so. What we all here just witnessed is exactly how emerging voices work. Although everybody decided to stick in a particular section based off of what they really care about, there was only 2 from this section, 1 from this section, and 2 from this section. And I want to point out, I have to do multiple roll calls for that. It takes a special individual to stand up and speak out, right? They have no clue on what I'm going to ask them to do, but whatever it is they're willing to do. And this is exactly how emerging voices work. You guys can go sit down, but please remember, you are, that your emerging voice is around you later, okay? All right, so keep that in mind. Now, let's break down emerging voices a little bit more so we get a better understanding of what's going on here. So, when we think of social movements, right, what's essentially happening here in the early a person sitting right here have a thought in their mind about what they disagree with, right? And figure, I gotta do something about it, okay? That's where it really starts at. Now, right? Then you have those people who are willing to come to the front and be a forerunner. Now, as I noted earlier, there are some voices that I do believe eventually arose within each session. They may not have been willing to come up to the front. When it is the time for them to be an example, they would. And although they are not seen, they are definitely heard and they're definitely felt. Then you also have key figures like celebrities, right? Artists, right? People with influence who endorse your movement. It's actually a very useful tool because they're able to capture a lot of for your movement. So here are a few examples. We got Martin Luther King Jr., right? Right there, if you're familiar with him. Oh, everybody, yeah. He's a key figure. Hey, okay? Who everybody knows. Love brains, right? Now, we also have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, right? When we think about the suffrage movement. Again, key person, you know these names, and it's because they are the emerging voices. They are the people who volunteered to be the first, to be the forerunners, right? Then you also have Terriana Burke, who is the founder of the Me Too movement. And one thing that they were able to do very well to mobilize their movement was to use celebrity endorsements like actress Alyssa Milano, right? So let's talk about collective action. What is that, right? We know that there's people who are willing to come to the front and be the forerunners and come up with something, but what exactly does it mean to you and everybody else, right? That's collective action. So collective action is actions taken by a group of people done by self-interest, right? It also includes a common vision that's aiming at achieving the goal at hand. And essentially, again, you're agreeing to come into agreement with people so you can get your goal accomplished by working together. And that's what collective action is. Now, I want to point out two important terms here when we think about collective action in the organization of movement, which is centralized and decentralized. Raise your hand if you heard those terms before. Raise your hand if you heard centralized or decentralized before. Think about it. Okay? Now raise your hand if you heard these terms in reference to movement. How to organize. Even fewer, okay? It was a good thing we're covering this. So when we think of a centralized organization of people, does anybody want to explain to me what's going on there? What centralized means in terms of movement?
One person has a voice, they speak for the group and they act on those words.
Yeah, big part of it. Anybody want to add to that? Anybody? Right? Not only do they speak for others, they have the power and the authority to send out what everybody else is going to do, right? It's centralized. You can pinpoint that particular person and a particular location and understand what's going on in terms of structure. Now, decentralization, what is that about? Anybody tell me what's decentralization? What's that structure look like in terms of organization? I got one up front. Oh. I got one up front. Decentralization.
Oftentimes decentralized organizations won't have decision-making process, or there is one, it will be very tentative.
Okay, so let's build on that, right? It's not that
Well, I was gonna say, last semester we talked about Black Lives Matter. How is it decentralized?
I'm gonna get into it, don't worry, I got you. All right, so decentralized essentially is saying, look, there's not one point of contact or one specific person that we can just go to, right? It is a horizontal structure, meaning that I can come over here and ask you guys, like, what we gonna do about our food, right? And you guys can put it back forth. And I can come over here and ask you guys as well, and you be able to do the same thing. And likewise over here, versus centralized, right? Someone here and say, hey, what's that is? Okay, and we go off to this one person and then we move on, right? Now, as Eric brought up, and a good example of decentralization in terms of organization of a movement is the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Historically, both movements were held underneath, the umbrella of centralized, which, as we know, the last PowerPoint slide, that there are key figures that we can point to for those specific movements. Now, what happened when they took out Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.? What happened? No, right or wrong, what happened? Yeah.
The movement lost a lot of steam.
Yeah, momentum started to die. They took out the head, and everything started to follow suit. Now, contrary, the base are held with the black man, divided into self. Their structure. Although you may be able to take this one out over here, hey, we got somebody over here that's still popping, right? And if you take this person out, we still got somebody over here. It's hard to track down who the person is, but we're still gonna get our goal accomplished, right? So, let's road map again, because again, we're covering a lot of information, and I made you move a little fast for you guys, so maybe ask questions, but here we go. We started out with historical examples of what movements are, right? Then we began to figure out what exactly movement is, definition. Then we started to break down some of the main characteristics we see when we think about movement. And after that, I asked you guys, why do movements even take place? Found out that, hey, look, somebody said, hey, enough is enough, and then placed a demand on the change that needed to happen. Then we moved on to who can actually be a part of a movement. There are potentially anyone, but these potentially anybody's hold specific characteristics in order for them to be a part of the movement. And then we move on to how exactly get started. We employ three main things: messaging, collective action, and emerging voices. Then we broke each one of those down specifically, minus messaging, which we will get to. Now, let me ask you another question. Where do you guys think movements take place? All things considered, right? Covered a lot. Y'all should have a little bit of knowledge now, working knowledge. So where do you guys think movements take place? Where do they happen at? Come on, right here to learn, no right or wrong, we're gonna figure it out. We got one right now, okay, right.
Anywhere, or maybe like in social media, it's like anywhere.
Social media, okay, good one. Right here with the hat and the brown coat, coat fly, by the way.
Mainly in places where a lot of people will notice it or feel changed by it, either like join or like spread the word around that's happening.
Like public face painting, all right. So up in the front.
You're those who have the power to go and have that opportunity, I don't know that.
Good.
I was just gonna say pretty much what he said, like public spaces downtown where a lot of people are gonna see what's going on or be affected by it.
So let's get into it. Go ahead.
There are places where an incident incites the movement.
Okay. One more second.
There are places where an incident that might have incited the movement actually triggered something.
Yeah, okay. All of those, great examples, right? We're gonna get into what happens at each stage over here. We're gonna start off with local and what happens there in terms of where movements take place. At the local level, reminding you guys, we can think of things like grassroots organizations, right? Or interest groups. Okay, something specifically happened in my neighborhood, in my community, and I decided to do something about it and band together with those in my community, my local community, to do something about it. Okay. Then at the state level, right? Some of those impactful things you see at this level are things like protests, at sites where things happen, right? Okay, the Capitol, or wherever the injustice is faced, as you pointed out. But something very specific that happens at the state level is the use of public referendum. Does anybody know what public referendums are? What are public referendums?
So like where they vote on something to like change the current law.
Okay, anybody want to add to that? If someone to add to that. That's all right, I got you guys with this one. So, the key about public referendum is that it's a direct vote on a matter by the people. But the key here is that you need a petition. You gotta get a certain amount of signatures on the matter that you want to address before you can even go to the next step. And once you do that, then the people will be able to vote it and then you'll see changes. This is something that happens at the state level. Now, when we think about the global space, right, these are social issues or political issues that are on a global scale. Things like sex trafficking, right? Things like poverty, things like genetically modified food, but it's because all these things are something that affect us on a global scale. And last but certainly not least, something we see very common in today's movement is the use of social media platforms, which somebody pointed out, right? But essentially what's happening here is that by your fingertips, or click of your fingertips, you can spread your message to somebody over in Ohio or somebody else, right? Really quick and easy. We use things like Twitter, Facebook, right? And even TikTok to send messages and be able to mobilize movements on another scale. Now, messaging, right? What's going on with messaging and movements? I give you guys some key points here on how to have a successful messaging, method when we think about movement. So the first thing we want to know is that a clear, specific message is going to far outweigh a vague or something that's unclear. And again, one of you guys may be saying something here about violence against women, and honestly, it would be your best interest for everybody to be repeating that same thing. And that always be the case, right? Even if some people like, yeah, this is what we should do, but gotta get it done. Or not just self-fulfilling. So again, the use of clear and specific messaging is key. Now, the second one I think really illustrates the heart of messaging, and it's very important when you think about movement. Okay, you got diagnostics and prognosis, right? So essentially what's happening in diagnosis is what? What happens in the doctor diagnosis? What do they do? Tell you what's wrong, what the problem is, right? And that's something that you really want to do in your movement. Make sure it's clear about what is happening. But even more important, hopefully if I can give this to you, what are the prognosis? How to remedy it, how to fix it, okay? That's offering a solution and allowing for others to know exactly how they can get to that point. Right? Now, when we think about using master terms with wide appeal, I think somebody talked about this in terms of where they happen, right? A wide scale. But movements use this in order to, capture people that maybe those specifics didn't get. So for example, although we're talking about climate change, that's not a specifically, but if we kind of start to talk about, some of the organizations that are attached to it, you might gather some more people, right? And that's essentially because things like civil rights are more known. Maybe not the specific mechanics behind it, but the term itself, a lot of people know and essentially agree needs to be something that's okay. Then when you you're thinking like, who exactly am I trying to attract, right? Who was this message actually going out to? And you really have to consider this because the way you decide or design how you're going to do that really matters, right? In terms of success for your movement. And lastly, security media coverage. And in today's time, this is very, very important, right? Using mass media as a tool. How do I use it? Who do I need to go to, right? How am I going to get my message across to multiple people and maybe at a small amount of time? So let's do this.